It's always a pleasure to welcome Einat Wilf on this program. She is an author, a former MK at the Israeli Parliament, the Knesset, and a staunch defender of Israel and Zionism. We are discussing her wonderful essay in the journal Sapir titled The Palestine Propaganda Complex. Shalom, Einat. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you.
I wish to begin by wishing you and yours a happy Passover. I know that these are troubled times for the Israeli state, so how would you reflect on this occasion?
It's tough to reflect because there's a sense that we're still in the middle of it and we don't know where it leads. There are scenarios that are all over the place. One of the things that has happened since October 7th is that we have come to appreciate that even very dark scenarios should be considered not only possible, but even probable. Some days it looks as if we're watching the beginning of World War III in slow motion. So it's really tough to know. It's tough to know if this is a moment, if this is the beginning of a long extended period. Not yet clear how we get out of this. So yeah, it's an odd time.
Yes, of course. So I think we are entering the seventh month of the conflict, starting with October 7th. And would you say that right now Israel is conducting a defensive or an offensive war?
Well, the war in general is clearly defensive in the sense that it began after a massive and brutal invasion by Hamas into the sovereign territory of the state of Israel. And right now, the purpose remains the same, to ensure that such an invasion could not happen once more. In that sense, it's completely defensive. It's taking place in the Gaza Strip, even though by now most of the forces of Israel are out. So we're in this interim phase where the major phase of the war is mostly over, but there's still a lot of work to be done, because the problem is that within Gaza, what Hamas has been doing for at least the last decade is to create a fully integrated, call it civilian war machine. So the entire Gaza Strip, the entire population, the entire civilian infrastructure has been created as the infrastructure of war. Not a lot of people understand how ingenious the method is. What Hamas basically did for the last decade is divert aid, cement, assistance into creating hundreds of kilometers of tunnels underneath the entire Gaza Strip, connecting it to Egypt. That's where everything could come in. And there are hundreds of shafts under mosques, schools, kindergartens, homes, and apartment buildings. And the way that Hamas fights, because it operates within a very supportive population, basically every home is part of the war machine of Hamas. So every home has weapons that have been placed there, under beds, under teddy bears. And what the Hamas fighters do is they don't wear a uniform. They wear civilian clothes, and they either go under the tunnels or between the houses wearing civilian clothes. You couldn't tell the difference. And then they get to a home, and the home is already stocked with weapons, RPGs, grenades, and from that they're attacking. So this is why also you see so much of the destruction, because every home, kindergarten, school, mosque is part of this integrated war machine. So the Israeli Defense Forces are still in the process of trying to dismantle this. This has been built over a decade, and it's not really clear how much longer it will take until it's all dismantled.
Okay. Final question on the current conflict. How how would you believe Israel's response to the recent Iranian attacks should be?
Again, it's tough to know. It was clearly a major step up. You know, for decades, everyone has been talking about the fact that this is a war of Iran against Israel and against the West in general. Iran has been waging the war against Israel, but also saying that its war is very much with America, with the West. Um, but it has been waging it through proxies in Syria and Lebanon, in the Gaza Strip. It's trying now to build its power in the West Bank. It's trying to destabilize Jordan. So it's trying to wage the war through various other means. That's what it did for decades. And this was the first time that it did it from its own territory. So this is clearly a step up. Even if this particular round is over for now, the war has clearly gone to a different level. And in many ways, this war will probably not end until the Iranian regime is no longer in power.
I see. Now, ever since October 7th began, I've taken some responsibility on this program to, in some ways, debunk the linguistics aspects of the war, which, of course, you've addressed in your essay beautifully. So my question to you is, are you at all surprised that immediately after October the 7th and the world knows about Hamas's attack on Israel, the the languages of anti-Israel and anti-Zionism starts to flourish like wildfire?
So this is, of course, the one thing I'm not surprised about because I've been studying it for the last 15 years. I've been seeing it rise. I've been seeing the language develop. I've seen everything that is being said now was said before. Just it wasn't as noticeable. It wasn't as wide. But again, claims of genocide, they were made before. All the ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and in general, the goal, the fact that this is what I've been arguing for a while, that the purpose of all this language is to ultimately create an environment by which there is no legitimacy for the existence of a sovereign Jewish state, and there's no legitimacy for the defense of that state. And we're seeing that in full force. We saw it with the ceasefire now, which was basically a means of saying Israel can't defend itself. Israel should not be allowed to dismantle the entire infrastructure created by Hamas. The ceasefire was always intended only for Israel. You never saw any calls for Hamas to surrender, for Hamas to hand over the hostages. So I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen before. I've seen it being prepared. So I was not surprised to see it flourish as it does right now.
Mhm. We are talking now in the wake of the recent anti-Israel protests in Columbia University in America. And, you know, my heart goes out to all of the Jewish students and faculty members who are stationed at American universities right now. I think Berkeley is one of them too. And so I wonder, how has the universities, especially American universities, been a fertile environment for these kinds of languages to thrive?
They've been a critical place. The two critical places where essentially the universities, the international organizations, and you could maybe add general human rights organizations working with the international organizations. This is a strategy that was begun in the 60s by the Soviet Union. It goes even earlier to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion by Tsarist Russia, but it was really perfected by the Soviet Union, the use of academia as the means of giving respectability and the use of international organizations as the means of giving respectability to the equation of Zionism with all that is evil. So I sometimes called it the placard strategy because you see it most noticeably on anti-Israel placards. The placards are built as equations. On one side of the equation is Israel, Zionism. Sometimes they just draw the Star of David. Then you have the equation sign. And then on the other side of the equation, you have a list of words that are all used, not because they describe reality, but because they connote evil. So the words that have been promoted by the Soviet Union in this placard strategy is Israel, Zionism, Star of David equal imperialism, colonialism, racism, apartheid, and then it escalates to Nazism and genocide. And what you've seen with each one of those words, the way that they gain respectability is by creating an entire academic system around them where you actually get PhDs. You get PhDs in Zionism is colonialism, Zionism is racism. And what happens is that these PhDs and essays and books begin to cross-reference each other. So it begins to have this respectability and it becomes this impenetrable wall where everybody cross-references each other and thereby establishing Zionism is colonialism, Zionism is racism. And then you take it to international bodies, like the Soviet Union with the Arab world brought Zionism as racism to the United Nations in 1975. It brought Israel's apartheid to the UN Commission Against Racism in Durban in South Africa in 2001. It now brought Israel's committing genocide to the International Court of Justice. So this whole notion of laundering these ideas through the UN, through international bodies, through international organizations and academia is the way that it creates the background so that when people go around and say genocide, apartheid, Nazism, they feel they're being respectable, right? They're saying the kind of things that people get PhDs for. They're saying the kind of things that are being said in the UN, and it creates a complete linguistic encircling. And of course, what I've said for years now, I call is that words matter. Because, in the beginning, a lot of people are like, so who cares? So fine, they're calling you like genocidal baby killers. Why do you care? It's just name calling. But my argument is that words shape how we think. And especially these words, these are powerful words that people consider evil. Why was Zionism as racism brought to the UN in 1975? Because a few months earlier, the UN decided that it was going to fight racism. So if the UN decided that racism is bad, now let's say that Zionism is racism, and basically this way we're saying Zionism is bad, and the UN said so. So once you say that something is evil, Zionism is evil, Star of David is evil, Israel's evil. Did you see this placard? It was very popular in the pro-Hamas, anti-Israel protests. It said, keep the world clean. And it has a Star of David inside the trash bin. And this is the logical conclusion, because if for decades people become convinced that Israel, Zionism, Star of David equal evil, then they say to themselves, we have to rid this world of evil. We have to get rid of this evil. And any means necessary, you hear that, any means necessary are legitimate to get rid of evil. This is why when Hamas brutalizes the most pro-peace people in Israel, it goes to the people who did the most to try to promote peace, and it kills them and their families, and it kidnaps them, then the world justifies them because they said, well, those were evil people, and by any means necessary. So these words actually matter greatly.
Yes, of course. I think ever since October the 7th started, I've heard people who are in my circles putting, Israel and, that litany of other terms, apartheid, genocide, colonialists in the same sentence, most of the time with a straight face. And you started the essay with mentioning of the blood libel.
Yes.
Of course, I think nowadays in the modern world, virtually no one believes in the blood libel, at least in Christian Europe. But with a sigh of relief, of course, but I'm also very much horrified at the fact that something that is so obviously false can be believed by so many for so long. And I would like to equate, the canard that Zionism equals all these like really bad things to that of the blood libel. So I think, why don't you give us a summary of what the blood libel was?
So in the essay, I cite an older essay by Ahad Ha'am, an important Zionist writer from about 140 years ago, where he called his essay Half Solace. And basically, he's writing at the time, at the end of the 19th century, where there's been emancipation. Emancipation is when Jews were allowed to become European citizens, to join mainstream societies in Russia, Germany, France. And he's concerned that Jews are now becoming integrated into mainstream society. And when that happens, they begin to hear all the things that people said about Jews for centuries. Because up until then, Jews were in the ghettos, there were walls, they were less integrated into Christian society. But now they're becoming integrated into Christian society. This is a more secular age, there's emancipation. And he fears that as they are integrating, they will begin to internalize everything evil that is being said about the Jews. And he fears that they will begin to believe that this is what being Jewish is, that all these evil things is what being Jewish is, because what happens is that the Jews are a minority and they're surrounded by tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people who are saying the most evil things about them. And what happens is when you're subjected to this constant assault, people tell all these evil things about you every day, all the time. You begin to wonder, maybe I am that bad. Like you begin to internalize all the attacks. So what Ahad Ha'am said, he said, let's look at the blood libel. The blood libel, the original blood libel, was this idea that Jews kill Christian children and use their blood in their rituals. We are now marking Pesach, Passover. The blood libel was especially related to Pesach, to Passover, to the idea that Jews used the blood of non-Jewish children in making the matzah, the unleavened bread of Passover. And as a result, whenever you have stories, a famous one in London in Lincoln with little Hugh, when a non-Jewish child was killed, Jews were immediately blamed that this was part of their rituals, and then Jews were murdered in revenge for that. Again, it was a complete libel. But that is the original blood libel. And what Ahad Ha'am saw as half solace is that he knew that, and Jews knew, that the blood libel was completely false and wrong. So he found half solace in the fact that Jews knew that it is actually possible for them to be right and for the whole world to be wrong. And for the whole world to be wrong, as it says the most evil things about them. So what Ahad Ha'am hoped was that Jews would know that the modern blood libels were also wrong and that they were right. And I was basically building on that insight by Ahad Ha'am that right now Jews are subjected to this global assault. You are evil, you are evil, you are evil. I mean, basically, that's what Jews hear all the time with and by the way, the old blood libels got updated only a little bit. When you constantly hear Israel is killing children in Gaza, baby killers, baby killers. This is the emphasis. The emphasis is not on how Hamas has created a fully civilian military infrastructure. The emphasis is not on the fact that Hamas operates as civilian power. It's all baby killers. Well, it's not very different from the original blood libel. The idea that Jews kill non-Jewish children for no reason whatsoever, merely because of their bloodlust, because of their rituals. It's updated, but it's not very different from the original blood libel. So what I wrote about is that, again, we need to remember what Ahad Ha'am said and to understand that the same mechanism as at work. What Ahad Ha'am called this mechanism of constant assault, he called it general agreement. He said, everyone agrees, and as a result, the Jews feel isolated and doubtful. And this is what we're saying. This is what the Soviet Union did. And the Soviet Union is basically the heir to the Russian Tsarist protocols of elders of Zion anti-Semitism. So they gave, in 1904, they gave it the respectability of a book. Now they give it the respectability of academia and international organizations. But it's the same idea: create a general agreement, create a surrounding environment where everyone repeats Jews are evil, Jews are evil, Jews are evil, by saying genocide, apartheid, racism. Those are just code words for evil. And then a lot of Israelis and Jews basically buckle under the pressure. They begin to say, maybe we are so terrible. And as a result, they don't want to defend themselves. They don't want to fight. They feel that they shouldn't. They begin to support their enemies. This is what we're seeing in Colombia. We're seeing Jews that are essentially have buckled under the pressure, and they want to show that they're not racist apartheid, and their only way of showing it is to support Hamas. Think how crazy it is for Jews to show that they are not genocidal baby killers. They actually have to support genocidal baby killers, like people who've actually made it clear that they want to destroy the Jewish people, who have actually killed families and children and burnt them alive. This is the only way for Jews to prove to other people that they're not evil, is to actually side with those who are promoting those ideas. This is how terrible it is. So that's what my essay was about, is about looking at this dynamic and reminding Jews that it is possible for the whole world to be wrong and for them to be right, and that they shouldn't doubt themselves.
Yes, of course, ever since the conflict, or at least this stage of the conflict began, I see people like Norman Finkelstein starting to pop up almost everywhere. And I think perhaps what you're alluding to is that people like Finkelstein, who are ethnically Jewish, but actively speaks out against Israel, they are speaking out of a sense of guilt and shame that is, unjustified.
Yes, they're basically trying to prove that they're the good kind of Jew. One of the ways that the general agreement, the pressure on Jews is often created, is by telling Jews to distance themselves from their people. And the pressure is to prove that they're the good kind of Jew. And the way that you prove it constantly goes up. I talked about it. I wrote a separate essay called The Pound of Flesh, where I said that Jews are basically demanded, in opposition to Shakespeare, to actually constantly mutilate themselves, their identity, to prove to the world that they're not like the other Jews. But the problem is, of course, is that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. These Jews are being used. In many ways, I would say they're being abused in order for the attackers to pretend that they have nothing against Jews. But this is how it always worked, going back to the Middle Ages. Which Jews were platformed? It were the ones who converted to Christianity, and they were the ones who were used in order to attack the Jews who didn't convert. So, and this is basically a modern version of conversion, kind of show us that you're the good kind of Jew, so show us that you ally yourselves with the anti-Jewish sentiment, and we will let you live for now. It never lasts.
Yes. Now, previously in 2021, the same flurry of anti-Israel language blossomed, and the same words were being used: genocidal, apartheid, colonial, you
Yeah.
name it. And I've thought about between that and this time, I thought that usually the first response to any Zionists or defenders of Israel would be to defend against the charge, to show that, hey, we're not
Yeah.
an apartheid country, we're not genocidal, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the time has come to take a more offensive strategy, in that to attack the motivations of those who launched this attack. So I can see that you're in agreement with this.
Precisely. I think in many ways, this is what the essay was doing. The essay was basically saying, this is the mechanism, this is what they're doing. There's no good faith about it. And you're absolutely right. The mistake that we've made over the years is to think that this was actually a discussion about Israel. So they would say apartheid, and then we would show that Israel's not apartheid, and we would spend all this time writing books and essays and to explain that we are not this thing. Sartre actually wrote about it long before this particular campaign started. He said that that the people who taunt the Jews with all the claims, he said they actually know what they're doing. And this is a form of abuse, to kind of he said, to force the Jews to show that their pockets are empty, that that they have nothing. So he already described it decades ago, and this dynamic has not changed. So kind of the Jews are the ones who have to constantly explain and defend and show that this is not true. And what I try to do in the essay is to show the mechanism, how it works, that there's nothing innocent about it, that it's not good faith, that it's not about describing reality. It's about creating a global mindset by which everyone will believe that Israel and Jews who support Israel are so evil that anything that can be done to them will therefore be justified.
Now, I'd like to dedicate some time to, I suppose, dissect or analyze how this glossary of terms come to be. You've said in the essay that we need to study how these terms come to be associated with the nation state of Israel. So I think now would be a good time to do so. Now, given the wake of South Africa's, I guess, suit against Israel in the International Court of Justice, I suppose we could start with apartheid. I understand that one of the motivations that brought the South African nation to do so is that currently their politics are in shambles. The ANC has lost almost all credibility amongst South Africans, and I suppose they're doing so to kind of deflect from this news. But where would you trace the origin of the Israel is an apartheid state denotation?
So basically, all of the claims appeared in the Soviet Union. So as I said, the Soviet Union is the heir to Tsarist Russia. Tsarist Russia began the idea of giving libels respectability with the publication of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in 1904. It's important to note this was a massive success. This book has never been out of print. It appears in every language in the world. And for example, in the Arab world today, it's considered a serious book rather than a KGB forgery, or the early KGB version. The Nazis didn't invent much. They actually used pretty much the ideas of the protocols, the libels, in creating the environment that made it possible to basically murder Jews en masse because they were believed to be evil. The Soviet Union basically continued that strategy, but this time they replaced anti-Semitism, because officially the Soviet Union was not anti-Semitic, with anti-Zionism. They used the word Zion from the protocols, and they created this equation. So apartheid, racism, imperialism, colonialism, all these words, Nazism and genocide, all these words already appeared decades ago in the Soviet playbook. The ANC, of course, is very much associated with the Soviet Union. You highlighted their failure, which is very important because historically, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, obsession with scapegoating Jews is always the mark of a failed society. It's always the mark of societies that have crises and they need to blame someone, and blaming the Jews has a long and successful history, so that's what they do. So you're right, the ANC doing it is first because of their Soviet history, and second because they are utterly failed, and this is what failed countries and states do. The only new words that I've seen over the years is, for example, white supremacy. White supremacy was not a Soviet invention, but it really shows you that the placard strategy doesn't care about reality. They just care about what's most evil. So when white supremacy, especially with Black Lives Matter, began to be like this word of evil, then immediately that's the word that became attached to Zionism, because again, it was a great new way of saying Zionism is evil. So this is how it works.
Yes, I spoke at length to the scholar at the Wilson Center, Isabella Tabarovsky,
Yes.
about this whole Soviet origin of anti-Zionism, and it's a fascinating read.
Yeah.
And of course, when you trace the movement of was it Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, BDS, you can trace it back to South Africa. Was it the World Conference Against Racism in Durban? And the founder of BDS was there.
Yes.
I think what I find is that before Israel, or I guess concurrent with Israel, South Africa was the pariah state of the world because of its genuinely apartheid system. And I wonder if the goal of not just BDS, but the what you call the Palestine propaganda complex, its goal is to destroy the state of Israel by making it a pariah state.
Of course, and they say that clearly. As far as they're concerned, when they try to look at things that were successful in destroying either the Jewish people, and what they did with South Africa is South Africa actually had apartheid. It was official. It was the official policy. One of the ways that you see that this entire complex works is that South Africa actually had apartheid. It was declared, it was official, and there was a boycott, and the boycott worked, especially once the Soviet Union collapsed, and that was it. Apartheid could come to an end. Israel doesn't have apartheid, but they go the other way around. They want to turn Israel into pariah state. They want to destroy Israel. They want to bring it down. They want to make it impossible for Israel to defend itself. So they say, okay, let's claim that Israel's an apartheid. It's not that Israel has apartheid, but let's make that argument. And again, because Israel doesn't have apartheid, they need to make these kind of arguments in order to give it respectability and to publish books. But they need to remake the entire word, because Israel doesn't have apartheid, so they actually need to give the word new meanings and make up new stuff in order to claim that Israel's apartheid, and then to call on the world to boycott it, and that's and thereby bring it down. And the escalation in the language is also the escalation because it doesn't work. You try to say Israel's colonialism. Well, if it's colonial, then we'll just throw it out, right? Because colonial powers go away. But what are you going to do? The Jews are not foreigners in the land of Israel. It's their homeland, right? We're now celebrating Passover to next year in Jerusalem. Jews have said it for centuries and millennia everywhere in the world. The only land in the world to which the Jews as a people were ever connected is the land of Israel. So the Jews are not foreigners in the land of Israel. In many ways, you would argue they're the first nation, the first indigenous people of the land of Israel. So colonialism doesn't work because the Jews are going nowhere. You know, we've been faced with violence and wars, and we're not leaving. because we're not foreigners. So we're not like the French in Algeria. We're not like the Americans in Afghanistan. We're home. So colonialism doesn't work. And then they try racism and apartheid basically to try to get the Jews to end their state, to kind of say, okay, we'll be a minority in an Arab world. But the Jews are a people and a nation. We're not just a religion. We have every right, the right of every nation to govern ourselves. So that doesn't work. So now they're trying genocide and Nazism, hoping that the world essentially will wage war to bring us down. But the problem is, because all of these are lies, we keep fighting because we're fighting for our very survival, and that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to fight against our survival.
Now, one of the things that people who use the term Israel is a colonial, or as they would put it, the settler-colonial state, is that I've seen this many times where they would show a series of maps. The first one on the left would show, was it the land that is Palestine before the creation of the Jewish state, and you see a lot of green that representative of like the Arab land, and then it slowly disappears.
Yes.
Either the land that is populated by Jewish and Israelis will be white or blue, and these like little pockets of green would be populated by Arabs. So it's kind of like their way of saying, see, you're taking over Arabian land. And that would bring me to your lengthy dissertation on how the term Palestine comes to be rid of its like a colonial implication and becomes like this catch-all term for the oppressed Arabs.
Yes. So first of all, there's a great piece by my colleague, Dr. Shani Moore. I recommend people look it up. It completely shows how all these disappearing maps are completely false. The amazing thing is that Gaza, when Israel left Gaza in 2005, that's actually the first moment in Palestinian history where they completely control land. And of course, they didn't turn it into a prosperous place. They turned it into a war machine. But yes, in the essay, I discussed Palestine and how the word was kind of deformed in order to make the claim that the Jews are foreigners. So historically, the word comes from, especially in the Christian and European use, is from the Roman Emperor Adrian, who after subduing the Judean revolt, right? So the Judeans are in Judea, they revolt against the Roman Empire. After a couple of times, he finally puts the revolt down. Some of the leaders are exiled, the land is laid waste. And one of the ways in which he hopes to destroy and ensure that there's no more rebellions is to destroy the connection between the Jewish people, and the Judea, the land of Israel. And he renames it Palestina, based on some invading tribes from the sea. So he renames it Palestina, and it's part of a Roman notion that you can erase memory. But what happens, ironically, is in the Roman lands, in Europe, in Christian lands, the name Palestina, Palestine, becomes associated with the history of the Jewish people. So for centuries, if you see a map of Palestine in European Christian books, it's the name they give to the geographical area where the Jews once had their homeland. So actually, ironically, Adrian did not succeed because the Europeans understood Palestine to mean Jewish. And this is why when in the early 20th century, when the Ottoman Empire is over, and by the way, the Christian Arabs, they brought the name Palestine into Arabic, kind of with Christianity. Because they were Christians, they had the idea that Palestine was this geographical area. when the Ottoman Empire is broken up and the mandate system is created to help the local peoples achieve sovereignty, then you have a mandate for Palestine. And everyone understands that the mandate for Palestine means Jewish. And how do we know that? Because it says, recognizing the historical connection between the Jewish people and Palestine. And this was unanimously agreed. So the nations of the League of Nations, they all know that Palestine means Jewish and that the connection with the land is the historical connection of the Jewish people. And they even say, and because we recognize the historical connection, this is the grounds for reconstituting the land. So reconstituting the land, meaning again, we know that the Jews are again going to be sovereign in this land the way they were before. So in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, you see the Jewish people begin to build the foundations of their state. And you see a lot of things called Palestine, and then it says Land of Israel. So you see football teams, and they're called the Palestine Football Association. And sometimes people put those memes on the internet to say, you see, Palestine existed, and the colonialists took it away. And then you look at the name of the football players, and they're all like Kreuzer and Goldberg, and they're all Jews. And it's all Jewish. It was understood to be Jewish. Even the Arabic language paper, Palestine, was by the Christian Arabs because they understood Palestine as the Christian name. So this is all Jewish. And then when Israel is established, Israelis understand that Palestine is the colonial name. Another way we know that Palestine is the colonial Roman name of the Roman Empire that was intended to erase the connection with the Jews is that when Jordan was created, when the British tore away 80% of the land that was supposed to be for the Jews, when they tore away 80% of the land to give it to the Arabs, they made a promise to the Hashemite family. They immediately call it Transjordan, and the name Palestine is limited to the 20% strip of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, plus the Negev Desert. And they forbid Jews to settle in Jordan. So it was understood that once you don't allow Jews, it's no longer Palestine. The place where Jews could settle was called Palestine because that was understood to be Jewish. So when the state of Israel is established, it does what every state in the second half of the 20th century does as soon as the colonial power leaves. It gives itself the name that it wants, the name of its history, its language, its people. So we call it Israel. That's our name. That's the history. That's the name of the land. So we call it the state of Israel, in the land of Israel. So this is how we express that the colonial era is over. The Roman Empire is gone, the Ottomans are gone, the British are gone. Finally, we're sovereign. We give it our own name, Israel. Now, the Arabs of the land, they were trying to prevent a Jewish state, beginning already in the early part of the 20th century. They fight, they try to prevent a Jewish state, they try to prevent, unfortunately, successfully, Jewish immigration, basically condemning hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jews to actual genocide in Europe because they prevented a Jewish state from being established in the 1930s. They fight against it again in the 40s. Now, one of my favorite things to show, I'll try to show it here, maybe later you can show it in another way. I don't know if it comes across clearly, but do you see the two maps here?
Yes, of course.
The two-color map is the partition map. The orange was supposed to be the Arab state. This is what the United Nations proposes in November 47. And the greenish blue was supposed to be the Jewish state. Now you see the map in blue and light blue. That's the incidence of malaria in the early 20th century. So what you see, it's almost one-to-one. The land that was given to the Jewish state that was proposed was the lands which Jews reclaimed from malaria, plus the Negev Desert. So this is about the most uncolonial thing to do. What Jews actually did in coming to this area in the 19th century, early 20th century, Jews, it's important to mention, Jews always existed in the land of Israel despite all the exiles, and many of them came over the centuries. But with the idea of building a state, they really only start to come at the end of the 19th century. And what do? They purchase land. This is, and the land that they purchase is the worst kind. It's the malaria land. That's the only land that is sold to them. And they use technology and they use education in order to basically rid the land of malaria. So those are the areas that later become the basis for the Jewish state. Now, the Arabs could have had their state, right? The orange part is huge. They could have had their state. They got the best lands. We got the malaria in the desert. We made it good, but it wasn't good to begin with. They got the best lands, and they still said no, and they went to war. And even after the Jewish state was established, they said that the war is not over. They don't want a Jewish state anywhere between the river and the sea of any size. So one of the ways, and they do it with the Soviets, this is also one of the Soviets and Arab ideas, is rather than call the people Arabs, until that moment they were called Arabs, is to begin to call them Palestinians. And the idea is that they take the name Palestine, which was associated with the Jews for 2,000 years, and now they hijack it to mean Arab and to mean exclusively Arab. And then you hear a phrase like Palestine for Palestinians, and it makes sense to you. And suddenly the Jews become foreigners. And it's a complete inversion. And on the basis of that inversion, you create Zionism as colonialism and apartheid and all that, because once you hijack Palestine to the Arabs and you turn the Jews into foreigners, you can claim that they're imperialists and colonizers in a complete inversion of history.
Yes. Another sleight of hand tactic that I see being used is this severance between the connections between Judaism and Zionism, which I find are deeply connected. I think for the most part, anti-Zionists are trying to say that Zionism is not Judaism, it's not part of Jewish history, and that is just a European idea that was imported into the Middle East or Palestine. So to what extent would you falsify that charge?
Okay, so first of all, broadly speaking, the connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel is the most foundational element to what it means to be Jewish. Everything about who we are as a people is connected to this land. Our rituals, our language, our calendar. The Hebrew calendar is the agricultural calendar of this land. It makes sense in this climate. So when Jews are exiled, they preserve themselves as a people, but in connection to this land. This is what it actually means to be Jewish over the centuries. It means to maintain yourselves as a people until the moment that you are back in the land as a people. Now, especially in the 19th century, the idea of trying to separate the Jews and to make it only a religion rather than a tribe, a nation, a people, a connection to a land, that was part of the 19th century emancipation. People are always surprised when I tell them that the idea that Judaism is a religion, and certainly a religion only, is a Western construct from the 19th century intended to allow Jews to basically become Germans and French and to assimilate. We began our discussion with that era of emancipation. Zionism as a political movement. So there's a difference between the ancient connection between Jews and Zion which again, that's for all Jews. Even Jews that are anti-Zionists, theologically, you know, sometimes you see these Jews wearing these Jewish black clothes, and they tell you that they're against Israel and against Zionism. They're against this state of Israel because it was established by secular people. But they still believe in the Jewish idea of the restoration of the Jews in the land of Israel. This is fundamental to being Jewish. They just think that we need to wait for God to send the Messiah to do it. So that's the difference. But people are surprised when I explain that the idea of Judaism as a religion is a very recent one and is not a Jewish idea. Now, Zionism as a political movement begins in the end of the mid-19th century, really takes off at the end of the 19th century, and it is built on the ancient relationship between the Jews and the land of Israel, but it also includes modern European ideas, that's true, that Jews have the right to self-determination, because this is the idea that has shaped the world. This is why we have Denmark and Sweden and Norway and France and Germany, the idea of self-determination, the idea that people govern themselves. This is why we have all the Arab countries. When empires were gone, they were basically replaced by states, and the idea of especially the self-governing, self-determining nation state. That is the basic idea for the Jews as a people to have self-governance. And the only place that Jews ever made sense as a people is in the land of Israel. Now, when anti-Zionists today try to claim that it's separate from Jews, they're not engaged in some theological debate. The reason they're trying to do that is because anti-Zionism, as it was created by the Soviet Union, is a very effective replacement for anti-Semitism, because, right, as I say somewhat darkly, Hitler gave anti-Semitism a bad name. So people needed a replacement, and anti-Zionism is an excellent replacement. But for anti-Zionism to succeed, it needs to pretend that it's not anti-Semitism. And this is why Jews who are anti-Zionist get platformed. They're very valuable. I've talked about the pressure. But what I began to research is what happens to countries that adopted anti-Zionism, right? So anti-Zionism as an ideology really happens only for the last century, ever since there's an effort to destroy the Jewish state. And if you notice, every place that anti-Zionism became the absolute defining ideology, the outcome was that no Jews were left. So anti-Zionists can always claim that it's not against Jews, and that's what they claim. But in practice, every country, every society where anti-Zionism became a governing ideology, the Arab world in the 40s and 50s, the Soviet Union in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Iran today, American campuses, you're actually seeing it whenever anti-Zionism rises, even though they say it's not against Jews, it's not against Jews, the bottom line is no Jews are left. So this really shows you what it is in practice. And like we discussed earlier, it's no use arguing the theory. You know, is every time someone is an anti-Zionist, are they against Jews? It's not personal. The question is, what happens to a society that becomes anti-Zionist? And here the record is clear. When it becomes anti-Zionist, ultimately no Jews are left.
Finally, I'd like to direct the audience's attention to your superb essay collection, We Should All Be Zionists. I see that you have the cover of that displayed on the video feed on your end. And I love every essay that was written in it. Of course, I'd like you to make the case for the title of the collection, We Should All Be Zionists. I suppose that means that not just Jews, but I suppose Gentiles like myself and even Arabs can all subscribe to the Zionist idea. How's
Yes.
it?
So, of course, Zionism as a movement of liberation and self-determination is for the liberation of Jews, for the self-determination of Jews. But everyone in the world can support that, can support that the Jews will have a state, that the Jews will be free, that the Jews will have self-determination. So for me, when I say we should all be Zionists, I take it at several levels. First is for a lot of Jews to understand that anti-Zionism is ultimately intended against them, even if they think it's not, and that the best way for them to stand up for it is to be unapologetically Zionist. So some of the essays in the book are about Jews standing up to anti-Zionism. And then some of the essays in the book are more general about how everyone can support it. And of course, some of the essays are about the Arab world and basically arguing that given that the reason we're at war is that the Arab world was anti-Zionist, the Arab world, and as a result, the Palestinians, and with their Soviet supporters and now their Iranian supporters, the reason they constantly used violence and went to war is because they wanted the Jewish state not to exist. So for me, the path to peace is very simple. Support the existence of a Jewish state and we will have peace. That's it. So in the essay, I look into Arab and Muslim Zionism as the path to peace, that when Arabs and Muslims support the Jewish right to self-determination, we actually have peace. Then we actually have nothing to fight about. The borders are not an issue. We can determine borders. We can determine, how we divide resources. That's easy. The question is the Arab world willing to accept a sovereign Jewish state in its midst? And we're seeing more voices in the Gulf beginning to say yes. And what I said is that this is the vision for peace. So this is why we should all be Zionists.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much once again, Einat Wilf, for joining this show.
Thank you. My pleasure.